Buen días, caballeros. Aquí estamos en el canal de Puro Chapín. Vamos a estar aprendiendo esta semana los presidentes de los Estados Unidos. Este güey aquí es el güey Ulysses S. Grant, güey. Ese güey en el billete de la 50, güey. Y Ulysses S. Grant era, perdón, eso es el presidente número 1, George Washington. Pero continuamos con Ulysses S. Grant, quien era el presidente en el año 1876. Él era republicano y vamos a estar leyendo para mejorar nuestros inglés, para que seremos bien chingón con el inglés, güey. ¿Qué tenemos aquí? Capítulo 1, The Making of Grant. En inglés en barreras, Puro Chapín. We might envision him on a steed tall and erect in the saddle. The classic portrait of a military leader. His uniform is sharply pressed, his beard flowing, his boots catching the light with their high polish. His eyes are shaded and his face is still, and if carved in granite, he is the greatest general in American history, save for General George Washington. But Ulysses S. Grant never looked the part. Ironically, the image just described better suits a different man, Grant's Civil War nemesis, Robert E. Lee. In Grant's case, we have to look beyond the ideal to see the real man, whose bearing was a little rough around the edges. Grant was a man of average height, 5'8", and is always described as slightly stooped. At the peak of his wartime fame, he weighed only 135 pounds. The snapshots of Grant at war show his slender frame, his rumpled uniform and muddy boots, his unthreatening demeanor, his dark melancholy eyes. He was, wrote biographer William S. McFeely, an ordinary man, which made him interesting. I liked the way he looked. McFeely wrote, the picture of the mild, rather small person slouched comfortably in front of a tent suggested neither the fierce killing warrior nor the bumbling and perhaps crooked politician that I had often read about. McFeely's prose was not always so flattering to Grant, but he could find little fault with him for his ordinariness. In many respects, Grant symbolized a particularly American characteristic, the ability of ordinary people to accomplish the extraordinary. Historians concur that Grant is an enigma. It's hard to paint a portrait of a man so inner focused. It's challenging to stitch together the contradictory elements of his character to form a complete picture. Inevitably, the confusion leads to inaccuracies born of ill will and supposition. Ron Chanou, whose reporting biography Grant captures Grant's complex character as few have, tried valiantly to clear through the muck of a century and a half of false narratives. Grant has been subjected to pernicious stereotypes that grossly impede our understanding of the man. Chanou writes in his more satisfying reconstruction of the truth about Grant. No doubt, much of the confusion is due to Grant's failure to conform to what we think is the nature of powerful men. Union Army Commander George Meade, who was no great fan of Grant, described him as an ill at ease, especially around strangers, a man who has never mixed with the world. Grant wasn't shy so much as extremely reserved, with a dose of moral rigidity. He despised obscenity and had little patience for any of the vulgarities common among Army men. Even as he achieved great victories on the battlefield and then attained the highest office in the land, Grant was consistent in his demeanor. When asked by a reporter if his father had changed when he took command of all the armies, Grant's son Fred replied, "No, that was impossible. My father was always the same. He was always great. He was always thoughtful. He was always gentle. He was always extraordinarily considerate of the feelings of the others." His wartime correspondence with his beloved Julia reveals a romantic streak that would not have been apparent in his public behavior. His deepest feelings were reserved for private moments. Even those who knew him best had trouble divining his inner thoughts. His brother in arms, the great General William Tecumseh Sherman, said, "To me, he is a mystery, and I believe he is a mystery to himself." Some of Grant's Civil War opponents accuse him of being a butcher, a characterization that is debated to this day. Yet, although he was unwavering in his strategic vision, he was kind in victory, heartsick about losses on both sides, and quick to forgive his enemies. His devoted military secretary, Adam Badu, wrote that after the war, Grant was the most popular man in America, in the North because he had been victorious, and in the South because he had been magnanimous. A reluctant politician, Grant was prone to political stumbles while in the White House. Yet he pursued the most ambitious campaign imaginable, Reconstruction of the South. Though it though it all he was humble, it is certain that nothing was farther from my father's mind than thoughts of pomp or power, wrote his own Jesse. Ulysses Grant had learned humility from his mother Hannah, but believed that praise should be given to God alone for allowing humans to achieve. The purpose of life was not to gain personal glory, she preached to her children. It was rather to simply do one's best. Because Hannah Grant had no concept of pomp or power, she never visited her son in the White House. On the day of his first inauguration, she was observed by a neighbor calmly sweeping her porch. We often search for the clues to the character of our heroes in the forces that shaped them. In the contemporaneous biography of Grant, written in 1885, the Honorable J.T. Headley noted that people look for the origins of the greatness of notable figures in their childhoods, and in the absence of early evidence, tend to invent romantic childhood tales about them. He cited Napoleon and Washington as examples. But the truth is, he concluded, circumstances make men. That's partly and maybe even largely true, but Grant's character stands out, and the sheer unlikelihood of his rise adds a special dimension to his story. Had his father not secured a place for him at West Point, without his knowledge, he might never have thought of being a soldier. He rose up in the ranks through skill and industry, but never had the qualities often associated with great military leaders: brazenness, a dominating physical presence, an outsized ego, or an authoritarian nature. In light of that, his success on the battlefield is worthy of attention. And so, this unremarkable man became America's surprising hero because he wrote a war memoir and letters expressing his deepest thoughts. We are fortunate to have an inside view of his character and journey. Before the 20th century, it was rare for a president to write an autobiography, but we can know Grant not only through the recollections of others, but through his own words, and it's quite a story. The one level white frame cottage in Point Pleasant, Ohio, was square and squat, comprised of one large room measuring 16.5 feet by 19 feet, which served as a living room, bedroom, and kitchen. A fireplace was at the center. It was tight quarters, but it had the advantage of overlooking the Ohio River, a floating highway with the steady traffic, the promise of grand vistas beyond. Newlyweds Jesse and Hannah Grant paid $2 a month in rent for the privilege of a world-class view. In reality, they were chained to the earth. Jesse was the partner in a tannery right next door, and they lived in the billowing stench of its bloody commerce. They had been married only a month, but Hannah became pregnant, and now their tiny abode would be accommodating a child. In the bloom of early spring, on April 27, 1822, Hannah went to labor, and Jesse called for a doctor, a stern-faced abolitionist who dispatched the nervous father to be to the outdoors. As Jesse paced nervously, wearing a track in the dirt, they had no porch. He heard his son's voice for the first time and was overcome with joy. 5 more children later, he would never forget the feeling that at last his life had come to its fulfillment. Within days, the relatives had descended, specifically Hannah's family, to convene a dramatic naming conference. Only the most majestic name would do for this precious offspring. Hannah's father favored Hiram, the Old Testament king. Her mother and Jesse preferred Ulysses, a romantic name from their reading of the classics. Hannah liked Theodore. Her aunt favored Albert. The proposed names were put in a hat, leaving the decision to chance. Hannah reached in and drew the name Ulysses. She passed. Hannah reached in and drew the name Ulysses. She paused, rather. Hannah saw the delight of her mother and husband, but she felt compelled to please her father. She announced that the child would be named Hiram Ulysses, but he was called Ulysses. It was a big name, but he was a big boy, weighing in at 10 3/4 pounds, with healthy pink cheeks, blue eyes, and reddish hair. During the long days of spring and summer, after the chores were completed, Hannah would sit with her son and watch the river. It wasn't in her nature to whisper to him of the adventures he might have one day. She never dreamed of another life, but when Ulysses' blue eyes lit up at the sight of all tall steamers making their way east, he might have been imprinted with the sense of a quest. If one were to choose a quality that most characterized Ulysses' upbringing, it would be independence, and with that independence came a physical courage that was evident in his earliest years. In this, he modeled his father, who matured his favorite son's spirit. Jesse's own youth had been one of great hardship and then abandonment after his mother died when he was 11. His father, Noah, an unstable wanderlust and sometime drunk, pulled up stakes and moved with his other 2 children to live with his older son, Peter, in Massville, Kentucky, birthplace of Abraham Lincoln. Jesse was left, our 16th president. Jesse was left to his own devices. Noah, who had served in the Continental Army and fought in the Battle of Bunker Hill, could have been a sterling example to his impressionable son. Instead, he abandoned him. Small and alone, Jesse worked as a hired hand at various farms until he was taken in by the family of Judge George Todd in Youngstown, Ohio. There he received room and board in exchange for helping Mrs. Todd with her 5 children while her husband was away on his circuit. Jesse was provided with a good home and the first formal schooling he'd ever received. He came to love Mrs. Todd, whom he found quite beautiful and kind. Missing his mother, he was comforted by her care. He was also determined not to become his father. Having had a taste of love and stability, he vowed to make it his pursuit. He set a plan for himself to marry by age 25 and retire rich at 60. Inglés y maderas, puro chapín.